Veronica Jobbins from Trinity Laban Conservatoire of Music and Dance.
Hi everybody, I'm Emma Redding and I'm from Trinity Laban.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Sancliffe and I'm from Trinity Laban.
And hello, I'm Sue Smith and I'm from Dance in Devon.
Thanks everyone. We'd also like to give you the opportunity to introduce yourself in the chat function, so not verbally please, but in the chat. So if you could just write intro and then your name, your job role, your institution, it will allow us all just to see the different kinds of colleagues who are with us. You don't have to do that, but if you'd like to, you're very welcome to do that. So I'll leave you to start to do that as we continue with the rest of the symposium. So just to give you a quick idea of the schedule for the afternoon, Katrina will be welcoming us all next, but we will work through giving you information about our systematic lit review, followed by a break. Veronica and Sue will then take us through the outcomes of the workshops and the report. We'll take another short break. We'll go into breakout group then for discussion of different themes that are emerging. We'll take a second short break at 4. And then we're really delighted to welcome our panel chaired by Dr. Angela Pickard, who are going to look at the overall picture of what we're presenting today in relation to the impact agenda for Dance for Health. We'll wrap the event up at 4:45 with suggestions, comments from those present, and we'll finish at 5, but stay open until 5:15 if there's anybody that wants to sort of stay on for a final chat. So I'm just going to hand over now to Katrina to introduce and welcome us to the event. Katrina.
Thank you very much. So I'm Katrina Wyatt, I'm Professor of Relational Health and part of the Wellcome Centre for Cultures and Environments of Health. And I'm delighted to welcome you all to this wonderful event on behalf of the Wellcome Centre. We were founded in 2017 to bring together humanities, social science and health and explore the complexities of health and well-being in its broadest sense across the life course. And this research is just such a fantastic example of the vision and aspirations of the centre, bringing together Dance in Devon, Trinity Laban and Exeter University to explore the relationship between dance and health and well-being. And for someone from the medical school, it's sort of at its most instrumental. It seems quite obvious that the impact of dance on health. But actually, there's something so much more about the health creating self-organizing spaces which dance creates. And that's why I think this research is so fantastic in its exploration of the complexity of the relationship between dance and health, in its exposure of where our methodological weaknesses lie, and in its extension of the debates around the nature of evidence and how we can begin to capture the qualities of dance as health creation. So I'm buzzing for this afternoon, super excited, and thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Katrina, for a lovely welcome and introduction. So we're going to kick straight off now into the first part of the symposium, which is sharing the outcomes of the systematic literature review. We haven't shared this with you in advance as it hasn't been published yet. It's under review at the moment, but when we do get it published, it's our intention for it to be open access. So everybody, you don't need an academic account, hopefully, to access it. It will be open access. So we will keep you informed as to when it becomes publicly available, but we can give you a really good insight into the literature review today. So the literature review and the whole project, in fact, really came out of a conversation that had been brewing over about 20 years, I think, between myself, Veronica Jobbins, and Emma Redding at Laban. For those of you who know me, I used to work at Laban and I did my PhD there, and there's a long history of conversations between us of these kind of questions of aesthetic, artistic and creative elements of dance, both in education and health settings. And we really felt it was timely and that there was a gap in what was on offer academically to try and better grapple with these three notions of aesthetic, artistic and creative contributions that dance makes for health and well-being, and particularly across the life course. So that's why we decided to undertake the project and, of course, the literature review. So the rationale Certainly, I think many of us are aware that there's the benefits of dance on physical aspects of health have been broadly demonstrated now. There's also a lot of work being done on the dance's impact on psychosocial well-being issues. But the understanding of these three elements that dance makes to health and well-being is under-researched and not well understood. And that's supported by these other colleagues from the Dance for Health arena that you can see here. We thought it was really important when we started out with a systematic literature review that we were clearly defining our terms, and you'll see later that this comes through as an issue in the field more broadly. So we felt it was very important as an opener to the literature review to really define the terms. Now you'll see they're substantial in the article when you get to see it. Then I'm giving you very sort of brief insights here, but these are the key areas that we chose to offer core definitions of. I'll just pick a couple. So really making sure that we were defining aesthetics, and for us that's the fact that an activity is made up of sensory, expressive and formal qualities which can be experienced, perceived and felt within dance, and also not overly connecting aesthetics with the notion of beauty was very important to us. Another one to just select creativity, so really acknowledging a huge range of definitions, fundamentally acknowledging the difference between big C and little c, and all the various other kind of dimensions and elements that make up possible definitions of creativity, but really kind of laying out our table there as to what we meant by these core terms before we started. The Dance for Health definition I'm going to give you in full here because that's really key. So for us, dance activity that takes place in various settings and has potential to positively impact health and well-being with the overriding focus on dancing, not therapy. And that's something to be really clear about, that we have not included therapeutic or dance movement therapy within the review. That was beyond the scope of what we were able to cover. We've also used the recently updated IADMS definition. I won't read that out here, but many of you will be familiar with this IADMS definition. So that forms part of the core of our own definition of dance for health within the paper. So what were we hoping this literature review might be able to do? We really wanted to try and help to ensure that policy and practice are informed by the most rigorous available evidence, and this word rigour will come up repeatedly. Really making sure that we're critical, there's critical scrutiny of that evidence to inform debate. So we shaped up two questions to achieve this purpose. And the two questions of the literature review were, what are the aesthetic, artistic and creative contributions that dance makes to health and well-being across the life course? And what methodologies are appropriate for investigating those contributions?
So keeping those two questions in mind then, we followed guidance on conducting systematic reviews in line also with other studies in the field. And we conducted a critical review of studies that looked specifically at these two questions. We began in autumn 2019, and we wanted to cover the 10-year period that we feel was important for Dance for Health work. So a lot of work had been going on pretty much between 2000 and 2020. We looked only at articles that were written in English language, and we felt it was really important to include not just peer-reviewed journal articles, but also grey literature. So this is in line with Paisley's stance on the value of incorporating grey literature in systematic reviews in order to allow for all available evidence and different kinds of evidence on a topic to be included. And as we know, grey literature often houses emergent sort of understandings and methodologies, which were particularly key given our research questions that may not ordinarily make it into academic and traditional journals. And given that this is a fairly new field of study anyway, we felt that was really important. Next slide, please. So this Prisma diagram shows the process we took to identify and select the literature for our review. And for peer review articles, we used 4 databases on health, education, psychological health, sports and performing arts. So we looked through EBSCO, combined search of the British Education Index, Education Research Complete, Education Resources Information, Centre, Medline, Sports Discus, etc. Ovid search on Psych Info and Psych Extra, and then searches using PubMed, the Trinity Laban library catalogue, including the Jerwood Library for Performing Arts. Now, the search identified 769 articles and 91 evaluations. 109 were identified for further analysis and rating, resulting in the end with 24 papers which were thematically analysed. Next slide, please, Carrie. In terms of exclusion criteria, we excluded studies that were focused, where the focus of dance was not aesthetic, artistic, creative. So in other words, if studies were just focusing on dance, what dance can do for the physical fitness of individuals, they were not included. We also excluded dance movement therapy studies because we felt that this more therapeutic work is quite different to the type of dance we were looking at, which was non-therapy focused. We excluded practices that define themselves outside of dance. So for example, somatics practices, where they were solely looking at somatic practice, and studies referring only to professional dancers and vocational training. Our search did not discriminate between dance styles. Next slide, please. So 109 papers were split between 2 researchers, and each of those were rated. They were rated according to their relevance to our research questions and for methodological rigour. And we applied a 5-point scale of high, medium, low, and low. At intervals, papers were selected for sort of cross-rating and calibration, and papers rated high or medium high for both our research questions and methodological rigour were included. So only those were included. In the end, the final 24 papers included 11 peer-reviewed articles, 3 PhD studies, and 10 evaluations. Now, to conduct the thematic analysis, 2 of us followed the standard process, which of course includes the familiarisation and coding of data, developing categories and themes, and reframing themes. And there were several midpoint discussions for further refining. And towards the end, categories and themes were shared with two other researchers to further refine. Findings offer 7 interrelated themes, each comprising a different number of categories, which we'll speak about in a while. Next slide, thanks. Somewhat surprisingly, 20 of those papers originated in the UK. And then in terms of the various foci, 5 papers were working with participants, 5 studies worked with participants with dementia, 3 with Parkinson's disease, and 8 included adults looking at well-being, adults and older adults. Well-being meaning physical, social, and emotional well-being. There were papers on well-being for among young people, including acute paediatric health and work on empowerment and resilience for disadvantaged young people. And the remaining papers focused on, for example, mental health, falls prevention, compassion fatigue, acquired brain injury, and emotional regulation. Next slide. Also surprising was that 10 of the papers did not specify age of participants, making commentary about the impact of dance across the life course, which of course was one of our areas that we wanted to look at, challenging. And there was also a greater weighting towards older adults, which is in line with Shepard and Broughton's review of arts and health. In terms of art form, 15 of our papers focused on dance solely, and that included creative dance, ballet, contemporary, somatics, South Asian dance, and tango. While the others, 5 on dance and 1 other art form, usually music, and cross art form was also discussed in 4 papers. Next slide. So in terms of the range of research designs and methodologies used among these 24 papers, mainly mixed method and qualitative. And the most common method was interviews, with 16 papers using interviews, followed by focus groups, and then standard tests such as, for example, standardized questionnaires like the quality of life scale, for example. Thank you. Next slide.
So this slide shows the 7 main themes that emerged from the papers, from our data, together with the categories that clustered around them. Just a few things to point out about these. We split our categories up into these 7 thematic areas, but they clearly interrelate. Identity and belonging had the most material in them, but they weren't always clearly distinguished from each other. There was a lot of overlap. Embodiment, affective response, and aesthetics were also all clearly linked to each other. In other places, sub-themes such as meaning making, the ability to change the future, presence, and touch made their own connections between the overarching themes. So overall, although we've tried to present this clearly through this thematic structure, we don't want to lose touch with the complexity and interconnectedness that seem to characterize dance's contribution to health and well-being. The themes are presented here in order from those that were supported by the most data to those with the least. So identity was the largest theme, and aesthetics was the smallest. One thing that it's interesting to notice about the 7 themes is that we see creativity widely represented as a topic of discussion in the papers, and aesthetics also appeared. But artistic, which was the 3rd part of our question, is missing. Artistry, or the notion of the artistic, was not often commented on. So that's an interesting absence in the data and from the thematic picture that we've produced. Next slide, please. We're going to talk in slightly more detail about the 2 largest themes, identity and belonging. Discussion of identity was found in 21 of the 24 papers reviewed. So it's a very prevalent theme in the data, and we found that there was a very active relationship described between the development of self-identity, well-being, creativity, and dance. Identity was often articulated as self-identity in a range of different ways, including the idea of bringing something of oneself to dance, through to linking to the idea of an inner self through dance. Creative dance was also connected with ideas about cultural identity and citizenship. Several papers refer to a constructed self and to temporality, so making links between past, present, and future selves, sometimes in a transformative sense of imagining new possibilities. The potential of dance as a space of meaning making was connected with well-being, and just over half of the papers talked about self-expression through dance, linking this with well-being in different ways. Finally, agency and creativity were closely interrelated in several papers, including descriptions of how people displayed or took agency within their dancing, discussion of the agentic capacity of bodies, and creative dance helping to enhance people's broader feelings of agency in the world. Next slide, please.
Belonging was the 2nd most weighted theme, appearing in 17 of the 24 papers reviewed. The in-between space of the individual and the group, as well as non-clinical or non-care related touch as a way to experience self and other, are highly relevant factors in how dance contributes to health and well-being by understanding the individual in relation to the collective, to feed social interaction, allow for vulnerability, and building trust. Togetherness comprises social connection, shared culture or cultural identity, inclusivity, group identification, and relationships. Connecting with those with similar movement limitations through individual and group expression helps to appreciate shared and unique ways of moving, which is important in linking aesthetics and health. Mutual respect and empathy was seen to create a welcome and safe environment where participants do not feel judged. Solidarity amongst participants was seen to result in inclusivity and intimacy. Welcoming environments also facilitate independence, positive attitudes, caring for each other, while supportive social environments was seen to help to develop personal and interpersonal skills. Next slide, please. There was less material to draw upon in answering our 2nd research question. 5 of our papers focused extensively or exclusively on methodology, so the data is weighted towards these, but supplemented from excerpts from other papers. The majority of the papers reviewed argued for the use of qualitative or mixed methods approach. Strong critique of quantitative methods is provided in several of the papers, and a reliance on a biomedical model of health is often allied with this methodology. Critique includes an inability to reflect the richness of the dancing experience or recognizing self-expression. But despite a qualitative dominance, there's an emphasis that there's no right research approach within this work. Questions are raised about how to best capture elements like embodiment, such as through more traditional phenomenological approaches that prioritize subject-led accounts, new technological methods, and practice-led approaches. Alongside this, we saw calls to engage both dance artists' expertise, as well as the participant voice, much more in research data collection and protocols. In viewing dance as a complex social, artistic, creative activity that involves rich and diverse processes of meaning-making, the methodological requirement to capture the complexity of the relationship between dance and health and well-being is noted. It might be argued that capturing complexity, reflecting dance's embodied qualities, and emphasizing process over outcome are at the heart of necessary future methodological developments in this area. Next slide, please.
So this slide really summarizes some of the points Rebecca's just made on methodological, what is considered methodologically appropriate for these sorts of contributions. And as Rebecca said, we found this question more challenging to look into in the literature. As she mentioned, the dominant methodology that was used was mixed method or qualitative, and indeed 16 out of the 24 papers were using either mixed method or qualitative. The biomedical paradigm was critiqued and considered to be particularly dehumanizing. So looking at dance as a way of sort of solving a problem as opposed to looking at what dance can bring and add to a person's well-being. Positioning dance as therapy makes it difficult to recognize artistic elements, and the critiquing of cognitive bias was clear, particularly in dementia research. So attention should be given when working with participants with particular cognitive differences, for example, bringing into sort of spotlighting really this need for including participant voice when designing research studies of this kind. Next slide, please, Kerry. So just in terms of the limitations of the research reviewed, well, we're mindful that the articles we looked at were all in English language, and we are well aware of Dance for Health research going on in other parts of the world that is written up in journals in other languages. Dance and artistic are terms that have been poorly defined in the literature. And then in addition to that, interventions, so what was actually taking place in terms of the creative dance projects, processes, were not clearly described. So this is something for future research, perhaps where future research efforts might lie in more clearly describing the interventions that are taking place in these studies. Terms were conflated in circular definitions, and there was a lack of consensus on how to measure well-being. And as we know, well-being is a multidimensional construct. There are different ways of defining it and therefore different ways of measuring it. Next slide. Thank you.
Okay, so just to start to pull some of this together, firstly, to pick up on a point that Ursula made, the interrelated notion of the 7 themes that we present is really important to take into account. In the paper, we actually talk about the fact that it would be much better if we could create a 3D sculptural representation of the 7 themes melding together rather than a kind of linear one-by-one description of them, because that complexity and fluidity was a massive message that came through as part of the literature review, and I think is something we really need to heed, as Rebecca was saying, in relation to how we then try and capture that in evaluation and research. There were some very clear connections to existing psychological theories such as self-determination and Seligman's well-being theory, and we felt that those could be made better use of as people move forward with research to make those connections to other theory bases. again, just to reiterate, the dominance of identity as an extremely strong theme alongside creativity. But as Ursula said, the absence of the artistic being a really interesting element of the analysis that we noted. Really kind of juicy subcategories coming through, things like touch, especially in the COVID era that we're in at the moment, that being a really strong part of the underlying weave of the complexity of the findings, and how we pay attention to touch and how we also pay attention to things like aesthetics they are very tricky, and that it certainly came through as a strong theme that we need to try and find better ways to understand and capture elements like that within what the contribution that dance makes to health. Sometimes terms were conflated as well, so self-esteem, self-confidence, and various other terms could be used interchangeably, a little bit like the circular definitions that Emma referred to. So I think one of the big messages is this idea that we really need to get clear on our terms. And it's not that we need one definition, but we each need to make sure we're defining our terms carefully when we use particular terminology in the academic literature. In relation to research question 2, that this really raised broader questions about ontology and epistemology, and what is the kind of correct approach to rigour to take in relation to different ontologies and epistemologies. So if we're saying that we know the world through a qualitative approach, we mustn't then judge it using quantitative rigour criteria. And the field expands. You know, we were also finding within the literature discussion of, as Rebecca was saying, philosophical analysis techniques, to investigate and explore lived experience from phenomenology. They, if judged by quantitative criteria, become slippery and hard to judge. But if they are judged by their own rigour criteria, that's where the conversation we felt the evidence was showing us needed to kind of broaden out to allow space in the research field for these methodologies to have their say. Well, I mean, it's not to just advocate for those, and it's to remain keep the criticality in relation to those, but to be really careful about the appropriateness of rigour criteria that are being used in relation to different methodologies. And I think, again, just to re-emphasise this point about the big message, another big message coming through from the papers in terms of methodology being to include participants and dance artists' voices as well. So just to wrap up on the literature review, really trying to value new methods with their own rigour criteria, and for us as a community to be brave enough to step forward and to use those new methods more, to think about and openly discuss the tensions between medical and social artistic models of dance for health. Reiterating what Emma said, the point about not seeing dementia, Parkinson's as deficit models. They are different ways of being, and really trying to see how they can contribute to our understanding of the life course per se. Really interesting work on how creativity might be defined in dementia settings that could really open up some of the other work on creativity. I think the other ones I've probably covered. So, but hopefully you're getting the kind of the picture of the big messages that were coming through from the 24 papers in the literature review there. As I said, the paper is currently under review with the International Journal of Qualitative Studies of Health and Wellbeing. As many of you working in the field will know, papers take an extremely long time to review, especially at the moment. So we can't give you access to that at the moment, but we hope sometime in the next year that it will be available. If anybody is particularly interested in the paper, please do get in touch and we might be able to share pre-versions with you, but we can't publicly share the paper at the moment. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up there. We have 10-15 minutes now for questions. If I stop sharing my screen, we're going to ask you to pop your questions in the chat, if that's okay. And then Sue is very kindly going to chair this next part of the session just to monitor the questions that come in. As we said, if you could write question before your question, that would really help us. Take a minute. It's fine if there's a little sort of pause while people gather their thoughts. They want to put some questions in and decide how they want to phrase those questions. So I can see lots of introductions there, which is fantastic as well.
Yeah, we have a question come through.
You have a question. Great.
So we have a question from Angie, which is, how are you defining aesthetics?
Okay, so I can offer some insight. I'm sure colleagues can contribute too. As I said on the slide, sorry, just give me 1 second. The main definition of aesthetics is, it's quite a traditional one, going back to people like David Best, Jacqueline Smith-Utard, and how they define aesthetics. But this idea that there is, it's not all about beauty per se, but it's very much about the set of sensory, expressive and formal qualities which can be experienced. And I would also like to comment that it's really great to have Sarah Houston with us today. She's not with us just yet, but we're with us later for the panel, because her work was really helpful in helping us to define beauty and trying to stretch that definition beyond a kind of performative, professional aesthetic into, as we were talking about, what is a quality aesthetic within dementia work, what is a quality kind of aesthetic within all of these different arenas, and keeping an open mind about what that could mean. I don't know if colleagues want to add to that. No?
Would you like another question?
Fire away.
So a question from Emma Warren. How do you hope your work is used, and what do you hope it opens up?
Emma, would you like a crack at that?
Yes, thank you. Sorry, Kerry, I forgot to unmute. Had to be one. Well, we hope that this is the start, I think, of a journey. You know, Dance for Health isn't new. It's been around for a while now, but I think this is probably the first time that group of people have ever looked at the literature in this way. And particularly, we were really keen, as I mentioned before, to look at the peer-reviewed articles and the grey literature, and to bring it together in this way will hopefully help others, you know, go forth and conduct more Dance for Health studies on a range of participants, you know, across the life course, looking at different kinds of methodologies. We're really excited about that particular aspect of this, you know, really looking at how best we can evaluate that active ingredient in dance that, you know, that traditional, perhaps standardized techniques just can't get to. So we're really excited about that, and hopefully this will kickstart lots of interesting research, you know, by many others. We're hoping to carry on as well, of course, but yeah. Thanks for your question.
Okay, a question here from Andrew McWilliams, who says, might there be ways in which a Dance for Health rather than well-being model needs illness to be seen as a deficit rather than just a different way of being? So picking up on what you said about deficit models.
Yeah, I think thank you, Andrew. I think that's a really good point. I guess it's not to eradicate that notion of deficit, but it's to introduce we're not introducing it, but certainly the literature is pushing for a more balanced view, so that there are deficits within that experience perhaps, but that actually understanding it as a different way of being was what was felt to be lacking in what was coming through in the literature. So I can see that there could well be times when that is useful for treatment, etc., for other kinds of treatment. But I think the message was about balancing rather than one and than the other. I think. I don't know if anybody else wants to. I can see Emma nodding. But
yeah, no, I completely agree. I think we're not suggesting that we're not looking at dance as a way of perhaps helping some of those differences or problems or illnesses, but that's not necessarily the focus, to just be trying to relieve problems.
Yeah.
Okay, a question around artists' voices being missing. So why do you think that the voices of artists are missing from the research, and how do you think it could be encouraged?
I mean, I think just looking at the studies, you know, that we reviewed, a lot of the time it feels a bit like there's the researcher and then there's the artist that's kind of brought in to lead the project, to lead the classes, but not necessarily be consulted in terms of how best to measure and evaluate that person's work. So I think what we're suggesting is that there could be a greater collaboration between those undertaking the research, the evaluators or the researchers, and the practitioners leading that work. they're seeing things in the studio or in their setting that perhaps the researchers don't see. So it's about bringing together those different lenses in a way to come up with a project that is robust, but it's really getting to the the essence of dance. That's really what I think we're trying to say. But I know that that's messy and challenging.
Another question from Rachel Hawkins. It was striking how 20 of the papers came from the UK. Is there something about the approach to dance in health in the UK or the approach to evaluating the arts which might be responsible for that?
I think that's I'm genuinely not sure, to be honest. It was a surprise, but I think we were anticipating a broader mix, certainly across Western English language speaking sources. It may well be that some of the practice, as you say, in this area of research in the UK is kind of generating more practice, but I think we've also got to remember that we haven't looked at non-English language papers, and as Emma said, there's plenty of activity going on, and that's a real disadvantage. None of us sort of speak further language enough to be able to have engaged with that, and that I think is some future work for the field, because I think it's probably masking a broader representation from other cultures, other languages as well. But it was certainly a surprise to us that was the breakdown. Yeah.
Okay, a question from Sue Fen Tan. Is there a way to minimise heterogeneity in dance research, since participants' type of dance and definition of well-being are so broad?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I think by default in a paper like this, the definitions were very broad. I think we might get into more of the nuance in the workshop outcomes, which are going to come next, that Sue and Veronica will be leading us through. Just double checking in on the question again. Because you're right, the heterogeneity acts against us because we want that kind of breadth, and this is all about the complexity of it as well. So trying to push back, and I think a lot of this could be helped by this question of definitions. If there's one big critique of all of us and colleagues in the field, saying, and then the dance sessions happened and we're kind of left in the dark, not knowing exactly what happened, what any kind of definition of dance was beyond a kind of label. And I think that makes it hard to get to the nuance of what different elements of dance can offer. Rebecca, I just saw you nodding. I don't know if you want to pitch in there, no pressure.
I think you wrapped that up really nicely, Kerry.
Okay, it's a question from Claire White. Why do you think artistic was not represented in the studies? Is this related to the nature of the interventions, researchers of individual studies, participants' view of themselves in respect of artistry, ...
Ursula, you commented on that. I don't know, and you haven't had a chance to pitch in, Ursula. Would you like to comment? Or?
Sure, yeah, it's a really interesting question, and it's hard to say why it wasn't there. But I think one thing that might kind of cast some light on it is that in our discussions in the workshops with practitioners and participants, it was also quite difficult to define and think about the artistic. So somehow that's something that I think that we might take for granted, is that it's an artistic practice, but without necessarily kind of giving a lot of attention to it and defining it. And that's sort of reflected in the research papers as well as in the conversations that we had with practitioners. Yeah, tricky, but all of those points that you put forward are potential explanations.
Is there room for one more, Kerry?
Yeah, I think we can squeeze in one more.
From Magda Kazmarska, who's offering a solution-focused question. Is there some potential for an interdisciplinary task force to address the design of evaluation models, measures and standards that address the tension between the medical and social models on the terms of the people for whom the dance is designed?
I would just simply say yes.
Yes.
Much nodding. And I think, yeah, that's exactly the kind of thing we need. And I think really opening up these conversations so that different stakeholders can understand other perspectives. You know, it goes back to why often aren't dance artists included within the conversations. The kind of language, whether embodied or verbal, that dance artists speak, the way they talk about the dynamics and quality of movement is very different to how a medical professional would talk about functionality of movement, for example. And it, in the first instance, is about breaking down the language barriers, the perception barriers, and opening up that ground to have those conversations so that you can have that kind of interdisciplinary fertilization, if you like, to understand what's going on from the other perspectives. I think that is a real, there is a great need for that, I think, to move the conversation, or to move the field forward through that kind of conversation. Absolutely.
And there are more questions, probably aren't going to have time to look at them all. So apologies if we haven't got to everybody. Where are we on time?
I think we probably need to go to the break now.
Okay. So sorry if we didn't get to your question.
I can see there are some great questions. And I will also, during the break, I'll put my email address in the chat so that if anybody wants to get in touch to reiterate a question or to carry on the conversation, that would be great. And I can take questions back to the team as well. So I'll do that during the break. But we are going to go to a break now until 3 o'clock, just to make sure that we don't get screen fatigue across the afternoon. So we will see you back here at 3. If you haven't already, please do mute your microphones and close off your cameras, and we'll see you here again at 3. Thank you so much for the questions and the engagement with that first part of the symposium. It was great. Thank you.
Hello, welcome back. Veronica and I will now share a summary of the stakeholder workshops that took place with participants of dance activity and with dance practitioners. The workshops took place in London and Devon with 2 groups of young people, a group of older people, a group of adults with acquired brain injury, and 2 groups of dance practitioners. Focus groups were led by members of the research team, with the dance class participant groups co-led with the group's usual dance leaders. Sessions included conversation, word association, moving, drawing, creative writing, and sticky note ranking of different evaluation methods. Due to COVID, some of those sessions were conducted online, and further data was collected through an online survey. For research question 1, responses from workshop participants were analysed in 5 main themes: aesthetic, artistic and creative contributions, relationality and connection, and self-perception. Cutting across these themes were 3 key concepts. Embodiment underpinned how focus group participants understood aesthetics, artistry and creativity. For example, seeing the quality of curiosity embodied in creative movement. This understanding of embodiment also appears throughout each theme, linking in particular to empowerment, expression, and to relationality and connection. Inclusivity and diversity also ran through the focus group's understanding of the 5 themes. Positive emotion was hard to place within any single theme, but more people commented on this than anything else. Participants reported that the aesthetic, artistic and creative qualities of dance contributed to feelings of joy, relaxation, being uplifted and experiencing hopefulness and happiness. Aesthetics was commonly understood as an exterior or visual judgment according to others' values, and participants referred to restricted or narrow ideas of beauty and quality. Lived experience was that there were collective appreciations of beauty and aesthetics, and that aesthetics were more likely to be understood as sensory or felt. There were comments about shared ideas of beauty in dance, particularly where it emerged from a collective movement or in terms of joining in with a collective aesthetic. This was described as motivating for participants. Dance practitioners reported on dance class participants searching for ways to describe the experience of dance, including the particular combination of things that they were feeling and seeing, and the connection with others through these senses. This embodied aesthetic might be empathetically felt by someone else, even though it was hard to articulate in words. The artistic contribution was associated with a sense of personal identity, although artistry was hard for participants across all the groups to define. But some participants linked it specifically to authentic, truthful, or sincere expressions. Others connected artistry with making art or being an artist, and understood in this sense it raised questions of inclusion and who was able to claim the status of artist. Some felt that artistry expressed a depth of skill and dedication to an art form, and some linked it to the idea of a process of discovery over one's artistry over time. Creativity was defined in terms of imagination, playfulness, curiosity, exploring and asking questions, making choices, and a sense of freedom and producing something new. It was seen as open-ended and inclusive and free from critical judgment. Everybody could access it. It was also linked to a sense of individuality and identity. And for others, it was about coming together and relating to others. Participants from all groups described dance in relational terms. Relationality was seen as both a condition and a result of creative collaboration. Some participants commented on how collaborating in dance could transfer socially into relationships in other contexts. And for others, there were new ways to connect to people, places, and things. Many people commented on feeling part of something. There was comments around increased confidence, including confidence in self-expression, developing confidence in collaboration, and practitioners witnessed peer support within groups that help participants not only to build skills, but also to build resilience. Also noticing people's confidence to accept what they were not able to do. Veronica, you need to unmute yourself.
Apologies to everybody. So to our second research question. First, we should say that the discussion in the workshops emphasised evaluation rather than research. And this was probably because the focus groups included more practitioner artists and class participants than academics and researchers. But please note that we felt that their comments had relevance to both evaluation and research. Also, it was widely recognised that identifying an appropriate approach to evaluation was a value-based question, which depended on many factors, including what was being evaluated and the purpose of evaluation. And I particularly like this comment from one of our adult participants. Well, it depends what you value, doesn't it? What do you value? What do you want to test? We couldn't care less about, whether we can put our coats on better or we can touch our toes. What we value is creativity, the artistic nature of this class. So, thematic areas. We identified from our analysis these three thematic areas that we've got there, and I'll just go through them one at a time. So the first one, purpose and rationale for evaluation. Many practitioners talked about developing practice, connecting this with reflective practice, and helping them to acknowledge achievements and supporting future planning as the value of evaluation and research. Participants similarly described evaluation as a means for them to reflect on their own experience. Fairly predictably, accountability to funders and levering future funding was seen as part of this rationale, as was advocacy. One class participant said, "We want to share with the wider world what is happening in our dance activities and the value it has for us." Also mentioned was accountability and monitoring participant satisfaction, and of course, quality assurance. So the focus of evaluation, this list sort of gives the major points here, and was certainly about measuring progression. And examples of the sort of progression we're talking about is changes in the quality of movement and progression in things like confidence. Reporting on subject experience and felt knowledge was important. Measuring or reporting on creativity, creative expression. Identifying impact on participants. And again, this was noted, it was across the life course, not just in relation to a specific nature of ill health, for instance. And measuring and recognizing the value of a class or activity to the participants themselves. What these sessions mean to us, one of the class participants said. So now, considerations for setting up evaluation. The focus groups were interested in a sort of 360-degree approach as to who should be involved in the design and implementation of evaluation and research. They suggested project managers, dance practitioners, artists, participants, as well as external evaluators. Everyone was very keen that dance practitioners' expertise should be recognised and utilised in evaluation. In particular, their ability to see and understand changes in how people were moving. There was this challenge of finding an appropriate vocabulary, and I think we've talked about this earlier today, for evaluating dance, especially when collaborating with other professionals. Dance practitioners describe trying to match medical language rather than using the language of dance. One of them said, "In order to answer them," that's the other people, "you're already stepping out of what you have experienced." There were mixed views as to the usefulness of borrowing different methods from other domains, such as the use of scales, instruments developed in different fields. Some recognise that these could be inappropriate for dance, failing to address some of the art form's less tangible, more playful and non-standardised qualities. Others describe the benefits of generalisability and transferability that came from using validated measures. And finally, practitioners discussed the time and space needed for evaluation, allowing time to making people feel valued and safe. You needed to slow down sometimes. So, evaluation methods, and we have a list here. Participants in the workshops were asked to rank evaluation methods in terms of efficacy in capturing the aesthetic, artistic, and creative impact of dance. This list shows the range of methods identified, with the most preferred at the top and the least favourite methods at the bottom, and the general pattern showing a preference for qualitative methods. Both groups surveyed ranked interviews at the top and questionnaires, with closed questions near to or more nearer the bottom, but there was some difference of opinion here. On to mixed methods. Next slide. Most people saw the value of mixed methods approach. It's about having a range of ways of asking the question. In addition to choosing a method that was appropriate to the questions being asked, practitioners considered which approach the group would enjoy and found some methods much more accessible than others for participant groups. And resonance with what we've already heard from the literature review as regards quantitative methods, validated scales were valued for providing results that are generalizable across different populations and accessible for people from other disciplines, useful for advocating the benefits of dance to a wider field, particularly to government bodies and other funders. But the challenges of applying questionnaires and validated scales to do with the reliability of data, closed questions limiting potential responses, and actually just participants struggling with reading and completing questionnaires. And real concerns that quantitative measures were biased towards things that are easier to test and not necessarily relating to things that were of value in dance. So qualitative methods, as we've already talked about, interviews and focus groups were most popular because of the open-ended nature of the conversations and interested in hearing about other people's reflections. There's a lot of interest in that. Methods that encouraged self-reflection. Visual data was valued for enabling different ways of thinking about an experience and not relying exclusively on words. Film was quite interesting as it allowed viewers to directly witness a change in people's movement and as a medium for presenting individual case studies where participants could speak for themselves, something that's often greatly valued by funders and commissioners. We heard about a range of arts-based methods, including several suggestions for using dance itself as a way to respond to or explore questions. Young people said, get them to experience dance themselves. Over to Sue.
So moving to our third question around the impact agenda. Discussion on this topic was less extensive within the focus groups than the other questions, and the question was addressed primarily from a practical standpoint around these four themes: funding, developing the evidence base, advocacy, and partnerships. The relationship between dance practitioners and funders was addressed, including the need for open relationships that allowed for flexibility and dialogue, and a willingness to allow participants to contribute towards the agenda for evaluation. Evaluation used primarily as an advocacy and assessment tool by dance practitioners for funders was seen as problematic. There was also broad concern that many of the current approaches to dance research and evaluation were not supporting the aesthetic, artistic, and creative impact of dance effectively. It was felt that dance was not often measured on its own terms, and groups thought work needed to be done on establishing more appropriate measures for evidence that were relevant to dance and to gain recognition for those measures. And that recognition should be sought to build relationships and confidence with government, commissioners, and funders for the impact of dance, the value of dance methods, and of dancer knowledge. Practitioners felt that dance participants could often be successful advocates for the impact of dance themselves, and that this could be used more effectively. Participants felt more and better use could be made of film, as Veronica said, to advocate to a wider audience, and perhaps best to health and care professionals. Working effectively in partnership in health and care was seen to be a crucial step towards addressing the impact agenda. And in order for this to happen, practitioners felt that more needed to be done to establish a common language that acknowledged dancer expertise and, I quote, a dance understanding of body, well-being and healing, rather than just a medical understanding. And that was from someone in one of the practitioner groups.
So finally, I'm going to just leave the particular focus on the stakeholder groups. And I'd just like to summarise the findings that bring together from the literature review and the workshop focus groups under some key points here. The findings indicate a need to accept the complexity of dance contribution to health in order to understand, research and evaluate it appropriately. From the literature review, we've heard about the 7 interrelated themes that emerge that demonstrate the value of dance beyond the purely physiological contribution: identity, belonging, self-perception, creativity, embodiment, affective response, and aesthetics. From the stakeholder focus groups, as we have discussed, the artistic, aesthetic, and creative contribution, relationality and connection, and self-perception, with those cross-cutting themes of embodiment, inclusivity, diversity, and positive emotion. As regards definition, the literature review pointed to the need for the dance community to consider and define the nuances of key terms, including dance, artistic, and dance for health. Since definitions were consistently lacking in the literature review, and contrasting definitions of the terms aesthetic, artistic, and creative also emerged through the focus group data. References to notions of felt experience, personal expression, authenticity, and truth lead to us to consider what we might learn from researching and evaluating the more intangible and ephemeral contributions of dance. Focus group data points to the challenge of finding an appropriate and shared vocabulary and means to articulate elusive properties of physical and phenomenological experience. As regards methodology, as we've talked about, there was a bias towards qualitative and mixed research methods, but there's certainly a great need to focus on creating space for new methods and understanding of appropriate rigour criteria within different contexts, for instance, in health-funded programmes such as social prescribing. While some elements of dance might be considered as elusive, it is suggested that they have a lasting impact beyond the individual dance interventions and shape how people lead their lives. This is one of the recommendations from the literature review, which indicates that it is time to expand the geographical, life course, and health condition scope of this kind of research, which might in turn contribute to a less problem-solving, more ongoing life course approach to the relationship between dance and health. The strong view that dance practitioner artists' expertise and contribution could be better utilised in research and evaluation, and the value of participant voice in research was identified, perhaps involving them in co-designing research approaches and recognising what participants determine as meaningful and impactful about dance, and a willingness for participants to set the agenda may also contribute to the impact agenda. So before we proceed to the breakout groups and further discussion, it's an opportunity for you to ask us some questions. Particularly, we'd like to focus on clarity to what Sue and I have been talking about. And if you could put your questions in the chat, as we did before, with the word questions in capitals. And I'm going to hand over to Kerry to chair this part of the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, Veronica. We've had our first question pop in from Emily Jenkins. I noticed this in, oh, sorry, that's an old question, apologies. No, I think you're repeating the question, which I think is very valid, Emily. So I noticed this in the report. Concern was expressed that quantitative methods, including standardised scales, did not always measure that which was important in dance for health practice, and there was a need to develop more appropriate scales. What needs to happen to develop more appropriate scales, and where would you start?
Sue, shall I start?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, it's interesting, that last point I make about what the participants themselves value. And I think at times, we tend, certainly the sort of work that we were involved in a few years ago, was we're tending to sort of like impose some of those validated scales. And a lot of the participants got a bit fed up with them. How many times did they need to write down what they were feeling? And I think we just got better at listening to them and trying to marry the two approaches of what the evaluators might be trying to find out with what was of value to the participants themselves. Does that answer that question? I'm not saying how you do it necessarily. What I'm saying is I think you've got to bring them together sometimes.
It might be also around the quote from your first slide, Veronica, around the scale maybe, can you reach something off a shelf because the intervention is a particular health intervention, whereas for the participant they might have started to do their hair when they go out, or go to meet someone at the weekend, or that they feel that they're expressing themselves in a different way, and these outcomes are nowhere to be found on the scales of evaluation that were being used.
And this is where the artistic comes in, by the way, because I think finding a language for us all, including the participants, to talk about the artistic nature of these activities helps us to articulate it, value them, and then moving on to that, evaluating and researching them better. And I think there's a big question there, actually, how we do it.
I think that takes us beautifully onto Gemma Lucas's question, which is about artistry, Veronica. She asks, in the artistry slide, you mentioned that some participants saw artistry as allowing different perspectives on bodies and self, bracket non-medical. Please, can you elaborate on this?
Shall I start, Veronica?
Yes, please.
I think this came from the idea of the body as being in recovery, or moving from an unhealthy to a healthy state, and that this was about considering a body and a moving body as an artistic tool rather than a healthy or unhealthy person.
Yes, and I think it's starting where people are at. I might just mention a group that we talk to a lot, a group of adults with acquired brain injury. As they said, they're not going to get better, and they say that, but who they are as people is really important to them, and expressing how they feel about who they are and what their bodies can do, and perceiving that as a positive and not a negative becomes really important to them. So it isn't all about, are you getting better? Because to them, that isn't necessarily what they're about in there. It's about them knowing who they are, that there's a change in identity as we get older, or just when we have these sorts of conditions that happen to us.
Great, thank you. I don't think the next question needs answering as such, but Magda is asking us whether we'll be publishing a white paper outlining these results. It's not something we have necessarily considered, but I think we probably should, following your suggestion, Magda. So thank you for that. And thank you, Emily, for reposting your question just regarding your comment there. It's much appreciated. Ian Russell is asking another question. Can anyone comment on where we are with drawing on participant voice, respecting artistic intention when individuals are living with cognitive, verbal, movement, vocab constraints?
I've talked about this quite a lot. I just wonder whether Rebecca or one of the other researchers would like to come in here in terms of participant voice.
I mean, certainly from my side, I think some of the varied data collection tools that were being used in the papers, and that certainly participants in the stakeholder groups were suggesting we use, are not relying on verbal cognitive kind of capacity. So visual drawing tools, you know, the young people saying, let's do some of this through dance. How can we use dance to actually evaluate? So that you take into account the participants' capabilities as part of the data collection method. So that voice is not voice quite literally, it's voice through other means, I think, would be my response to that question.
I think that relates really quite nicely to recognising like dance speaking on its own terms as well, that rather than not necessarily translating, but finding something that aligns really well to the lived experience of artistry and creativity within the studio or the dance activity, as aligning to that kind of participants' expressivity and artistry becomes really important.
Great,
I think we rely a lot when we're and I'm coming from a place of practice rather than academic research here, but I think when evaluating with non-verbal participants, we do rely a lot on the people who are close to those participants. So whether they are carers, enablers, care staff, family, and the artist who's delivering. So we do rely on artists as evaluative witnesses to notice how people might be moving differently, how they might be responding to the artist differently, for example, incrementally over a period of weeks. So it's a really important question. And I have to say, it's something that we are testing and wrangling with all the time, but it's one where we absolutely rely on the skill of the artist as witness and of the caregivers around those people.
And just to come in, dance language is available to help us to define this further. And one looks at chorological studies, for instance. There are various approaches out there. Some of our issues, I think, are seeing how well this is respected and valued beyond the dance sphere, which I think makes us reticent about using it. We might use it among ourselves, but how much do we feel that that is helpful when we're talking to other people that don't have that dance knowledge? And I think that's where the difficulties arise, and we need to bridge that gap, if you like.
I mean, it goes back to Magda's suggestion of the interdisciplinary approach. And I think, you know, in the same way that dance artists who increasingly work in health contexts might go on a training course for understanding the physiological medical sides of the people they work with, there's no reason there shouldn't be a vice versa. I think the power balance is perhaps not tilted in our favour to be taking doctors through a choreological studies course. But, you know, as you say, Veronica, there are absolutely mechanisms within the dance world for us to have these conversations. There are schemes and systems that we can use to understand this. So I think we maybe just need to be a bit more confident about, you know, publicising these and talking to people about them and saying that they can have value in this arena, I think. Okay, we are on 3:30 on the dot, so I'm going to wrap up there. There's a couple of questions still in the chat, but I would encourage you, if you have put further questions in the chat, perhaps bring these in as part of the discussions, because I think they're all threading around the same theme. So I'm going to hand over to Sue just to introduce the breakout groups now.
Veronica, in fact.
Yes. Yes, so we're going to move into breakout groups. Just to say that you're not going to have a chair when you get into the group. It is a sort of free-for-all discussion among you all. And we do suggest that you start with that last slide that I offered you in terms of the number of points that came across both the stakeholder groups and the literature review, and Sue is going to place those points in the chat, and they're there, the iterating themes, blah blah blah. And we'd like you just to start with one that interests you. If you can, move on to 2 or 3, but just before the end, could you nominate somebody who could take just 2 points and write them in the chat when we bring you back out of the breakout groups? We won't be having a feedback from each individual group, but we will just ask that person that you've nominated to write the 2 main points that you'd like to feedback in the chat, and then everybody can see those. Thank you.
So welcome back from your breakout groups. So would the nominated people from each group just take a moment to put a couple of points into the chat, just so we can get a sense of what's been happening in your conversations, and then to invite everyone just to take a moment to have a read through what emerges, and then we're going to be taking another break. So take some time to write and read, and then we'll see you shortly after our break.
We're going to go into our panel now, chaired by Dr. Angela Pickard. Angela, over to you.
So hello and welcome back, everybody. I have the privilege this afternoon of chairing our panel meeting. So we're joined by Nikki Crane, Fergus Early, and very soon, Sarah Houston as well. We have just half an hour this afternoon to run this session. So we're not able to take questions from the floor at this point, but there will be an opportunity at the end and certainly after the event. I know you've all had a really interesting afternoon so far. What we're going to do is just have 2 to 5 minutes or so with each panel member to start with, just to give their points of view on a particular heading that I'm going to give people in a moment. And then we're going to come together and hopefully have a bit of a discussion, which I will try my best to chair virtually. So it might be that our panel members just have to raise their hand when they want to make a point, so I can bring you in. Hello, Sarah, welcome. So what we're going to be discussing this afternoon, which leads really nicely, I think, from the last session, is that we're going to be thinking about how this project and the findings that have accompanied the project from the systematic review and the project report, how are they able to build wider understandings of the impact of health and well-being and dance? So Nikki, can I start with you? What's your point of view on what you think the impact might be on this work?
Yeah, sure. And please stop me if I'm going over my few minutes, because I do want to hear from Sarah and Fergus as well. And it's such a rich report and so much to talk about, but I'm sure a lot of that will come out in the discussion later. So first of all, really wanted to welcome the report. We of course always need more on dance, and we actually do need more reports on dance, and also really welcome the focus on the artistic, aesthetic and creative. Although for me, I never separate these things out, you know, as far as I'm concerned, the greater the art, the greater the health benefit. So just a little note at the beginning, really, to make sure that we keep all of these things in our sights together, because they all, you know, are interdependent. But it's good to illuminate these areas because, you know, we haven't taken enough time to look at them. So that's really great. I also think the context in which we're in is just worth mentioning for a moment. Of course, we are in struggling still in the midst of this pandemic. So I think the whole thing about being in our bodies, we've been hugely numbed and desensitized by the lockdown and the lack of social connection. And, you know, whatever connection we had with our bodies, you know, some of us might have lost. And we do need to keep thinking about mental health and well-being as people are. It's omnipresent for us all at the moment, to build resilience, you know, more social connection, and generally a positive outlook, which of course dance, bringing mind, body and spirit together, can do so powerfully. I was very interested to read the report in the context of my work at King's, and should mention that underway at King's, some of you will know, we're fortunate to have a £2 million grant from the Wellcome Trust. And we have a programme called Shaper, which is 18 months in now, but cruelly stopped in its tracks by COVID, although we've been able to do a lot digitally, and we're in the middle of that at the moment. But the reason I mention that is because, you know, the report talks a lot about connecting across the sector, you know, how we need to kind of stack this evidence up and our learning, and not be working in our own areas unaware of what else is going on. So this is early days for the SHAPER programme. SHAPER stands for Scaling Health, Arts, Interventions, Implementation and Effectiveness Research. And if that isn't an acronym to send you into orbit, I don't know what is. But anyway, in concise terms, it's basically a very important programme over 3 years to look at how we scale up arts and health interventions, how we build evidence for those, and how we embed them into the mainstream of the health system. So we're, you know, there's qualitative and quantitative research going on. In fact, 2 randomized controlled trials, one around stroke and one around Parkinson's, and 1 participatory action research, which of course brings, you know, the voice of the participant to the center of the research, co-designing the research. And Lucinda Jarrett, who many of you will know from Rosetta Life, has done a brilliant job throughout all of her work, you know, doing co-designed research. So I don't have much time to talk about that at the moment. Some of it might be teased out later, but suffice to say, there is that big programme, there is that learning, and we're grappling with the use of a range of methodologies, and we're a big team of 15 of scientists, artists and academics all together. And believe you me, there are some very heated debates, and that's as it should be, because it's in the mix of these things that we get the brilliant stuff coming out.
Thank you so much, Nikki. I'm
yeah,
going to just pause you there.
Yeah,
I loved those points. I thought the social aspect is something that we've perhaps had to adapt very much this last year. But the social aspect is so important in work in arts and health. So it's really important that we come back to that a little bit later, maybe in our discussions. Fergus, can I bring you in for your point of view, your initial ideas around the report and so on?
Right. As Nikki says, the report is very helpful right away in identifying so many new avenues for research that have not yet been explored. Obviously, as an artist, the areas of creativity, expression, aesthetics, and so on are, to me, as a practicing artist, of great concern. I've been thinking about, this is not really answering the question, but I've been thinking about the issue of aesthetics and arts, and just a couple of quick illustrations. Moving back a bit. I was leading a session, a dance session, people with quite advanced dementia in a hospital. And I'd given, in a burst of originality, everybody a scarf. And I was then encouraging people to explore their scarves, find out what they did, etc., etc. One man held his scarf like this. I came and danced in front of him and smiled and looked very enthusiastic and tried to involve him. Nothing. I went off, I came back, and still he was just sitting there with holding the scarf out in front of him. I just looked a little more carefully, just by chance, really, and I saw that actually he wasn't static. He was moving it at this pace. I don't know if you can see this. And up again. He'd taken a very, very deliberate decision, an aesthetic decision, to alter the quality of movement, the space, the time, and so on. I came and I joined him, took his movement, and went with him at exactly the same pace. And gradually he increased pace. And then we ended up in quite an involved dance together. And that was somebody who hadn't really appeared to be engaged at all. Similar group, again, it seems like that's all I do. It worked, but it's not true. I'd given people scarves. One person just went straight away, disappeared somewhere behind a sofa or something. The session went right through, and I thought, well, he's lost, he's not engaged, he wasn't interested. Why am I giving him a scarf? How stupid. And he came out from behind the sofa, and he'd wrapped the scarf beautifully, very carefully, all the way up, and attached it so it was completely, it was a complete work of art. Again, he'd empowered himself, and he'd taken us artistic decisions and made something out of what I thought was nothing. So my point really is that aesthetics are kind of tricky things to deal with. If I've got time, have I got a minute left?
You have 1 minute left.
Okay. Just one other example. Years ago, when people first started talking about arts and dementia, there was something that appeared in various conferences or books or something. It was an artist who had himself had dementia, and he'd drawn a portrait, at an early stage of the dementia, he'd drawn a portrait of a face, quite conventional, quite naturalistic, competent. Then it showed drawings he'd drawn later in the development of the illness, until the last one was like very, very distorted, very dark, and it was just meant, really, the illustrations were meant to demonstrate the progress of the disease, the effect on the brain and perception and so on. The interesting thing was that the final version of this portrait was far more interesting, was far more expressive, was if you can say that, was a better piece of art. Interesting. So, yeah, obviously I'm very keen on the involvement of practitioners in the research. I think it's very valuable for all concerned. I've valued very much some of the larger scale research projects that I've been involved with, particularly one that Trish Feller-Burrows and Ian Wilson made it with Green Candle's Remember to Dance program, people at different stages of dementia. And just one comment was that at some point, Trish had made had created tools to have a measure of creativity, some kind of measure. And the issue arose as to whether people were more creative, as I just was going over, more creative at a later stage of dementia, perhaps. And then I thought, well, should we be measuring creativity? Is that right? Creativity is something that we all have and we all need. And
it's a very interesting place to pause, I think. Sorry to interrupt you, Fergus. It's a really interesting place to pause. Should we be measuring creativity? That's very, very interesting. And I think if we move on to Sarah, then maybe we could come back together and look at that idea of the social aspects of belonging, identity, aesthetics, and perhaps this idea of measuring and how do we measure all of these aspects of arts and health work or dance and health work. So Sarah, can I just bring you in for your initial thoughts?
Yeah, so I think the first thought which struck me when reading the report from this project was hooray. Hooray for complexity, for example, because this is incredibly important to think about dance in a way which is often neglected. You can access dance on so many different levels because dance actually can offer itself in different ways. And this might be as an art form, it might be a social form, it might be as exercise, it could be as an intellectual pursuit, as a sensory pursuit, as a community building pursuit. And so this allows for a wide range of methodologies to be accepted within dance and for dance and through dance. I was very struck by, and I was really pleased to see that aesthetics was so prominent in the report. I myself have really wanted to champion this in my own work, and this all stemmed, I think, from a training where actually it was in where dance was important. So in a lot of research, it's easy actually to avoid the dance, to avoid the dancing and just look at the outcomes without actually seeing where they come from. And so it is really important to recognize, in not only through aesthetics, but in a lot of different ways, but in my own work, it's been aesthetics. It's really important to recognize that this is something to actually take account for in the research, whether it's measuring or interpreting or however you're doing it. So that's important. I could say more. I'm going to stop there because I know we're short for time.
That's super, thank you. Okay, so let's try and bring some of those comments together and come back to the word impact. It's one of the words that we've all got more used to hearing, I think, over throughout the landscape and dance sector. So in terms of some of the points that you raised, the social aspects being incredibly important, and how perhaps has that changed remotely? Have we been able to be sociable with our dance work and have that sense of belonging from a remote position? aesthetics being at the heart of what we're doing, and acknowledging dance as being at the heart of what we're doing, and what's special about dance as an activity or a route to development in health and well-being, perhaps. And then thinking again maybe about some of the methodologies, how are we measuring such things as identity, belonging, aesthetics, creativity. So who would like to take the floor now to build on some of the points that you made earlier?
I guess if I may go first, this idea of measuring, it is one way of doing research. It is not the only way of doing research. It suits some research questions more than others. And so, although you could try, and as researchers, I think we have to be creative, and we lose a lot of creativity sometimes. We forget, but it's true, we are. We could try and measure, for example, beauty or whatever. But there are some methods which suit this more than others. And I think this is where there's a tension between researchers who do practice different methodologies, come from different approaches and backgrounds and traditions to research. And some people would be very dogmatic and stick to things and say, we have to measure because that's the way we're going to prove things. But proof is not the only thing you can come across in research. And even for the research which tries to prove things, it's very difficult anyway. So, yeah.
That's a great point, absolutely. So sometimes we just want to find out more about something, don't we? We just want to build some experiences, some perceptions, some understandings, and build an evidence base. And it isn't necessarily that we're measuring progression in some way or change in that way. And that's a really interesting point. Thank you. Who would like to pick up on something here, or something that you started talking about earlier? Fergus or Nikki?
Well, shall I, totally agreeing with what Sarah is saying. And, I think we're always trying to put a square peg into a round hole, and, horses for courses and all of those different metaphors and things. But I think what we just need to do is think in the round, and how we can bring more, it's something about bringing all the expertise together. I guess I've done a lot of work with health commissioners on the ground, so I've been a bit hardened by, what's required in order to make the case, but I've always tried to resist that as well. But in the end, pragmatically, I've always found that it's been very effective to bring the quantitative assessment together, evaluation, research, when it's possible, and with the qualitative, because we are talking to human beings, and it's about the relationship that we establish with our decision makers and funders as well. No amount of evidence, doesn't matter how gold standard. I think people think that somehow they're going to be asked to do some sort of, there's going to be agreement on what constitutes good evidence, then we're all going to go and do it, and then we're going to hand it over, and then things are going to change. Well, they won't, because there's a whole culture around the arts and sort of dealing with certain sections of the health system where it's still going to be impenetrable. So we have to just draw upon every ounce of nous and resource that we have. So in short, I mean, I've always found it very effective to bring the quantitative, the qualitative, professionalize the qualitative as much as we can, so that it's convincing and well articulated. And then, of course, bring in the films and the experience of the live performance where we can. And obviously that's very difficult sometimes to get people there and to see these things. But with films, we've forced them under people's noses, and we know that has been the final trigger to make things work. So it's the way all of these come together, but also to say that we can start to design our own measures, surely. And I know there's been all sorts of efforts to do that, but I'm not sure how far we've got with that. And then to bring people into negotiation over that, otherwise we're going to be creating them in a vacuum. So there's a whole co-production thing that needs to be done with decision makers, funders, and it's not about going away and doing something and then having the conversation afterwards. Get them around the table and say, can't you see the dilemma that we have here? And we have tried to do that on a number of occasions, but obviously it's really difficult to bring all that together.
Great, thank you. So collaboration, interdisciplinary groups was mentioned earlier today as well. And thinking again about valuing what we are doing and being confident about what we are doing. Thank you. Fergus, did you want to add anything there?
Well, just I think that's critical what he's saying there, because finally, if there's a reason for research at all, which was one of the questions coming up, it seems to me that we're about changing society radically. And that's where we are, that's where we're coming from, finally. And so all those, as you say, Nikki, all those resources, all those different people in different places who are needed, we have to keep hammering away at them.
Yeah.
Because that's what we're about. And what I feel that's what research is about, to give us all, to help us all ammunition and pressure and all the things we need to change things.
Thank you. So what about these ideas then around identity, belonging, creativity? And we've also talked a little bit more about aesthetics and the artist development as well, the artist at the heart of what they're doing too. How can we make more of those areas in the work that we're doing with, again, this notion of sort of robustness and impact? How can we build the evidence base and the confidence within the sector to really value these areas and think again about the voice and the experience behind them? Tell us more about your experiences here, please. Sarah, are you starting again? Who would like to start that one?
I can start. I suppose that in response, Angela, I think there's two things which bring to mind. There's work to be done in terms of encouraging dance artists to recognise what is maybe what's happening or not. I mean, I think they do recognise this. It's about helping them articulate what is happening. And because I think dance artists have a very privileged viewpoint, if you like, of and a very coming from a very knowledgeable place about their participants, and they are in the room creating magic. And so it's there's work to be done in terms of, okay, so how do we articulate that magic, that those elements which indicate belonging, which indicate possibly a change, a development of identity, or and so on within the dancing. That's one angle, and then the other angle is for researchers and for policymakers about the impact of belonging, or the impact of self-awareness or identity, or whatever it is within the dancing. And as Nikki quite rightly says, this is done in various ways, but there are particular ways which can be easily seen and recognised by policymakers or funders or scientists. So I'd say that there's two kind of columns of work to be done.
And I think there's quite a lot in the report about, you know, the importance of embedding other professionals, you know, health professionals, clinicians, so forth, into projects. So we're talking about, collaboration all round, aren't we? Bringing artists in and, professional development and being part of all of the decision making. But it's terribly important to, like, I can think of some brilliant programs that I've been directly involved with. One was the Alchemy project, which was an offshoot of Dance United's work, working with in early intervention psychosis, where they embedded the clinicians from the word go. So in terms of belonging and identity, the trick here is to work with those professionals and say, how does this translate into your work? Because, in the health system, we're very far apart, and we're not far apart. It's a paradox, isn't it? Because, the health system is trying to encourage independence. It's about personalized care, in social prescribing now, it's about, giving people more meaning, in their lives beyond, doing purposeful activity in the community, not just dependent on medication. So there's the bringing together of all of these things, and these things can be translated when artists and clinicians work together and say, how do you express this in your line of business? How do we? And now in making the case jointly, and I find that really exciting. I don't find that stultifying. Oh, that's somebody else's language. I want to say it the way I want to say it. I actually don't find that a creative challenge. What I find a creative challenge is hanging on to our integrity and what we know works and what's important to us, that we don't take the soul out of it, but we're also able to talk another language in order to jointly and inculcate others with our language. It's an exchange, basically.
Thank you. And it's really useful that you've brought in the notion of social prescribing now, because that's obviously something that's very important to us as a sector. So Fergus, I think you might have the last word here. We have 4 minutes left. Can I just ask you to sort of summarise your thoughts around anything you've heard so far, or anything you wanted to add from an earlier discussion?
Oh, goodness. I'm not sure I can do that. Yeah, I don't know. I as an artist, one is trying to do one's thing and deeply involved in things like health. One becomes deeply involved, and they become really inseparable from the art. But we need help. We need help both ways. We need help to, I think, embrace what we're doing, all its possibilities, because it's always broader than you are yourself. And for us, I think the link with researchers is a very important and potentially, really world-changing connection. And we do have different languages, but we can find languages. We can find the words to make that really rich, that relationship. That's all I have to say, really.
Thank you. Sarah, there is a minute.
So about interest as well. If you interest people, then, and this is why it works when, for example, policymakers or scientists come into the dancing themselves. If they can see it, if they kind of get the bug, then it works a lot better, and you are speaking the same language if that happens. And I know I've been involved in a project in Germany where we've invited young scientists to dance and to create their own research, scientific research around what's happening, but they have to be paired, they have to dance, and they have to be paired with other people dancing, which has led to some really, really rich, interesting projects, but also understanding. And now they will go into their own professions and be advocates for dance.
Super, thank you so much. So we are coming into the last 30 seconds. So Nikki, did you want to add anything else? You looked as though you were ready to add a little point there.
I don't think so, really. I just so enjoy hearing my colleagues speak from different perspectives, but there's so much sort of confluence anyway. It's just a bit as usual that the same, we need to work as teams of people. Don't think that everybody can do everything. Some people are expert at turning the language into something absolutely brilliant, to turn it into a deal with a health commissioner. Someone else is great to be at the heart of the moment when brilliant miracles are happening in the dance studio. I think we just need to appreciate that we need all of this. You know, we are in a holistic milieu here, and we need to work it in that way and draw all our forces together.
Super, thank you so much. Well, it's been a very quick session. I think, you know, everyone could have talked for the whole half an hour on their own. Lots of wonderful experiences and research and understanding to share. The key words that have sort of come through during the discussion, certainly the social aspect in terms of collaboration, in terms of experience, in terms of voice, in terms of potential, I think has certainly come through the discussion in all of the examples you've given. So I will list these key words that I've been noting down as you've been speaking and share that with the rest of the group. And hopefully everybody will find something interesting in what's been said this afternoon. So thank you so much again to the panel. And it is time for us to close, unfortunately. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Angela. Did you want to share your points in the chat? Were you going to do that in the chat?
Yes, I will.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Angela. And thank you to all of you, Nikki, Sarah and Fergus, for bringing your expertise into conversation with our report, our work. It was one thing we were really keen to do, was not just to have it as you say, Nikki, a kind of closed thing, that we need to be out there sharing our work together. So really appreciative of your kind of having read stuff in advance and kind of taking the time to discuss it with everybody, in front of everybody today. Really appreciate that. And I think one of the key messages that stands out for me is this notion of conversations, the idea to involve colleagues in conversations from the very start, and how we share our languages. And I think having the confidence to share our dance languages as well, and not to shy away from that, to just bring them to the table, I think is really important. So thank you for that. So we're just going to shift now into the final stages of the symposium. We've got about 10 minutes left, and it's just really to open up to ask everybody, really, again using the chat as we have done before, what would you like to see happening next from everything you've heard this afternoon? So that could be participants, panel members, colleagues. What would you like to see happening next with this project? We are at a point where we're culminating on this phase. We're keen to raise funds to continue the work, to collaborate, etc. So it would be really helpful to hear from those of you who've spent the time with us this afternoon, what you feel like would be the most valuable next steps for this work going forward. So if you would like to put ideas into the chat, we can pick up on them for the last 10 minutes before we wrap up for the day. So I'll give you a minute just to start to contribute there if you would like, please. Okay, so I don't know if dance and health colleagues from the team would like to put their cameras on again so that we can all be reading, sharing thoughts together on these last comments that are coming in. There's a question. I'm not actually going to take further questions at this point. I think we'll just focus on any kind of comments and suggestions. If anybody wants to pick up on them as they're reading, or I will, then please shout. There's a request from Sue Fantan, who is in my breakout group. I know one of the themes that's been brewing is this idea of organisations coming together to create a nationwide research with standardised outcomes. I think that's certainly an idea I've heard a number of times across the years. And I think Nikki sort of picked up on this as to whether that is or is not the right way to go. I think it's a challenging thing to undertake. And whether that kind of process of presenting a large body of work is the way to do it, I think there are pros and cons to that. I don't know if anybody else has thoughts on that, but I think it's an idea I've heard quite a number of times before. I don't know if colleagues have thoughts on that. Yeah, Louise Marshall is saying developing mechanisms to communicate these values to stakeholders. Certainly in some of the conversations, there are ideas about GPs CPD sessions, which I think can be very powerful. So actually running seminars, training sessions for medical colleagues to appreciate the value and communicate it. Katie's talking about dissemination.
I think there's an interesting point that Emma's brought up. I think, Emma, you brought it up earlier on in the chat as well, about the community dance spaces where a lot of this work is happening being so much under threat through underfunding. And that certainly from Dance and Devon's perspective, there have been a number of times where there have been research projects happening looking at dance interventions, but we've not been able to take part of them in them because there's nobody to pay for the actual delivery. So I think research projects that can allow for extended periods of delivery in the community looking at these issues would be a really wonderful way forward.
I think so. It's actually about the kind of joined up projects that join up all of these things, because I also have experiences where colleagues involved in delivery projects will come to me and go, and we'd love you to come and research this, but we don't have any money.
Yes.
So
Yes.
that kind of process where actually having funding that covers both sides of the coin so that they can be in conversation from the start, as we've been talking about with other things, I think is crucial, unless you're talking about kind of bigger multi-million-pound projects where all these dynamics are in place. I think often it's one or the other, and trying to get those two things and more going on is a tricky bit.
I also wonder that for us to move beyond advocacy research, and this is something a lot of us have been talking about, we're often so hard trying to push the value of dance. We almost push ourselves into a silo, or we see ourselves in a silo, that we have to constantly say dance is wonderful. And I do think that that has skewed a lot of the research that we do. And actually being much more, I don't want to say critical, it's just refocusing the lens as to what are we actually doing. And from that, we can develop our practice. And in fact, it may be that we then do the dance better, because the dance isn't always wonderful. And again, there's this advocacy that all dance must be wonderful. Well, it isn't, not necessarily within different health settings or for health. So I think, again, we've talked in our work about nuance. And I would like to think that we're now going into a more nuanced situation after however many years of what we've been doing. And as Nikki and others have said, really trying to get good conversations with health practitioners, people that can help us say what is really going on in this situation, and then the value of it actually increases. But not just starting off with the view that we need to have a research project that shows how wonderful dance is in this setting.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's the key difference between the evaluations that used to take place. Not so much now; they're much more robust now. But years ago, evaluation was about advocacy and almost becoming quite self-congratulating. And I think now we're moving into this new phase where we are doing kind of maturer research, and that mature research is using innovative methodologies as well as traditional and more reductive, and they're all really important. But the key thing is to be very open to the findings, whatever they may be, and presenting them objectively. So I completely agree. And I think then we'll get buy-in from other stakeholders and different kinds of people. Yeah.
There's a lot of people in the chat talking about the CPD session idea, people finding time to actually have those conversations, share the expertise. Someone asking about whether play counts as an ephemeral contribution. I would say absolutely yes, Ian. I think trying to capture things like play and creativity, as Fergus mentioned in the panel, actually, asking whether we can and should be measuring things like creativity. And then Nikki's very kind of pertinent point that, you know, we have to be pragmatic about some of this as well. And it's getting the balance between the pragmatics and the using methods. Sarah made this point, using methods that are appropriate for the concept that you're trying to understand, evaluate and research. I think that is one of the key tensions at the heart of all of this. Just people sharing some good connections and contacts. So if you would like to pick up on, Nikki's shared a link, as other colleagues have shared links to their organisations, projects, etc. in the chat as well. So do take note of those before we close if you'd like to pick up on them.
Can I just add one little tiny thing, which I've put in the chat, which is, and it's raised in the report about phenomenology, if I get that right, yep. and many other approaches, because, you know, we undertook this, we put this symposium together a little while ago, and it was amazing, you know, what came out of, so bringing different approaches together with, you know, what we're doing in our own evaluation and research, and looking at how phenomenology and the arts, you know, look at new meaning. We were doing this in particular in the context of recovery from stroke, but it's an incredible dialogue. And yeah, do have a look at that website link, because there's a lot of information on there and a recording of that symposium.
Thanks, Nikki. And certainly from the systematic lit review, the notion of bringing in phenomenological approaches was certainly a really kind of valid one to put forward. Angie's mentioning multidisciplinarity to express the value of dance. I mean, I think that's a really good point. It's not that that any of the elements of the report or the systematic lit review are just arguing for qualitative work. It's that how we skillfully learn to combine mixed methods to bring quantitative and qualitative into conversation to get the best out of both ways of functioning. So I think that notion of multidisciplinarity, both in content and approach, is really, really important to take all of this forward, I think.
I think there's a side point, Kerry, no, it isn't a side point at all, from Bethany about ethical approvals. Particularly when one is working with a real range of groups. And this is certainly not my area of expertise, but I do know this is a really tricky area, and perhaps some of Rebecca and others could come in here. Actually, perhaps there's some shared knowledge about that that could be helpful. I don't know, Rebecca, because we were really stuck at one point, weren't we, with informed consent.
I think we've got something to say on this as well, but Rebecca, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, Gary.
I think this is where the coming together, discussing CPD or just sharing knowledge is really valuable, because as Veronica said, we've not yet stumbling blocks of how we can have an inclusive, how the research and evaluation we're doing is inclusive of all our participant voices. And we've experienced in the past, certainly with some of the projects that we've been doing at Trinity Laban, is that the research and evaluation becomes limited to those who are able to give informed consent because of the challenges of gaining ethical approval, and how we might, yeah, I don't quite have a formulated response, but some thinking about how we might be more inclusive in the way that we're capturing different voices and experience and evidencing the impact of the really wonderful work that's going on in the studio.
Ursula, I don't know if you want to pitch in on that point.
Yeah, sure. I think there was a question earlier that we didn't get to, which was about ethics as well, and whether there'd been discussion on it. And I think that there's a kind of ethical dimension that maybe hasn't come out so strongly in the report, but that kind of underpins a lot of the discussions, and is a big kind of consideration in the practice that was being discussed. So it came across as something that was a big concern for practitioners. It didn't come through in the data, which was why we didn't discuss it directly. But there are some sort of questions raised perhaps about the kind of match up between the ethical approval processes for the research and the kind of concerns around participant voice and how that's foregrounded in the research. Yeah, so there's a really kind of interesting dialogue there, I think. And as Rebecca's already said, how that may may at times be limiting in terms of whose voice gets included in the research, as well as being something that's really of concern in a lot of the practice itself.
Yeah. Brilliant, thank you, Ursula. I think on that note, we are going to have to wrap things up given the time. As I said, we will stay around till about 5:15 if anybody would like to continue the conversation. I am going to formally close the symposium now. So I would just like to say thank you to everybody for those next step suggestions. We will be saving all the chat and we will be ploughing through them in a meeting later this week to really see where we can take some of this. Next, I would just like to share, lastly, my thanks to everybody who's been involved in today and the sort of 18 months, 2 years that's preempted this event. A big thank you to the project team, also to the review authors for, us being able to access articles, the focus group participants. Thank you to our panel chaired by Dr. Angela Pickard, Nikki Kane, Fergus Early and Dr. Sarah Houston. Again, thanks to Katrina from the Wellcome Centre for introducing us today and for the funding from the UOE Wellcome Centre, which has made this work possible over the last few years. Also a big thank you to Emma and Mel for managing the tech today behind the scenes. They have made us all calm and be able to just do our job in the middle of it. So thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for coming along and pitching in their ideas. We'll be in touch after today. Where the PowerPoints, etc., will be available on the web page, hopefully, as will the information about the article when it is published. I'm sure we will all see some of you soon, as we know many of you and work with you at times. So I look forward to seeing those of you that we know soon. Take care and thank you again for coming. Cheers.